Welcome to the Come Up Starter Kit, guys. My name is Shanka, and I have a wonderful guest with me today, Jade Ralston, who is the Director of People and Performance at Northern Health. Thank you, Jade, for jumping on board.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here.
Wonderful. Now, I am going to be chatting with Jade all things psychometric testing, psychological assessments when it comes to your job search and what that all means. And Jade is going to decode all that for us, which is amazing. Now, Jade, I wanted to ask, what are your golden nuggets of wisdom for staying sane during this lockdown?
So I wish I had something really profound to say, but what's getting me through is literally Netflix and Stan at the moment. plenty of opportunity for binge watching. Lots of walks within my 5 kilometres, of course. But I do have to say, one thing that I have done a little bit more than normal is I have started baking. Something I hate cooking.
Oh,
that's
right.
Really, really strange. So I suppose that is one benefit, is learning how to bake some banana bread.
Oh, nice. Okay. And that's your speciality, banana bread?
Yes, because it's probably the most simple thing and it's very hard to get wrong. Cooking is not my forte.
Very good. Very good. Now, what I wanted to do is I wanted to give the audience a little bit about you and just give them a rundown about who you are. So if you could give us a 60-second rundown of who you are, that would be great.
Great, thank you. So I'm a mum. I've got 2 kids. I'm married. And from a career perspective, so I'm a psychologist.
Yeah.
I have general registration, which means I can work in a number of different fields. In terms of my early career, I started in consulting at a very small consulting firm, and then went to a very large consulting firm. And about 7 years ago, I took on an in-house position at Northern Health. So that's where I still currently am. Once I got into Northern Health, I was originally employed as the Director of Organisational Capability. Okay. And then 3 years into that position, I was then appointed to the Director of Human Resources, which has been rebranded to the Director of People and Performance. And
you guys are no doubt very busy at the moment.
Incredibly busy, yes. And it's a very challenging time, and it's really... it's encouraging us and forcing us in a way to think differently about how we do things, so we can respond as quickly as possible to support our staff. No, very good. Now, I guess what I wanted to ask is, what made you want to be a psychologist or even study psychology? So I've always been really interested with how the brain works and what makes people tick, and why do you behave that way but I behave that way. That's always been really interesting. But in addition to that, I just am a very caring person. I've always been the type of person, I'm very empathetic. It comes very naturally to me. So in combining those two things, I saw it as a great opportunity just to help people, as corny as that sounds. But during high school, that was what really attracted me to take the psychology courses at school and then go on to study at university.
Okay. And so you actually were a provisional psychologist, and then you moved into organisational psych. What is the difference between the two for people that may not know?
Yeah, sure. So in order to become a qualified psychologist, there's a number of pathways. The first one is you have to do an undergraduate Bachelor of Psychology, which is 3 years. After that, it's a 1-year graduate diploma. At that point, you've really studied a generalized version of psychology. To become fully accredited, though, you need to have a master's or a master's equivalent. So what that means is, at the end of your 4th year, if you want to become a clinical psychologist, for example, you'll go on and do a 2-year clinical psychology master's, and at that point you graduate as a clinical psychologist. I chose to take the alternate pathway. So rather than going through and studying a master's, I did what they called the 4+2, where the +2 is a supervised program, where you work with a registered psychologist and they are your supervisor, and then there's a number of tasks and assessments you have to do. And during that period of time, you're considered a provisional psychologist. So you have a provisional registration that allows you to work at a level underneath a supervised psychologist. And once your provisional psychology period of time has been assessed and cleared by the registration board, then you get your general registration, which is what I have now.
Okay, right. And then So then from there, you then decided, hey, look, I'll actually look at becoming or moving into organisational psych.
Yeah, that's right. So it's really interesting. I had always envisioned myself as a clinical psychologist. So that real traditional sitting, lay down on the couch and tell me how you're feeling.
About yourself, yes.
Yeah. And how does that make you feel? That was always the way I saw my career going. And I specifically remember the moment that changed for me. It was in my 4th year. And we were, of course, one of the major courses or classes we had to do was ethics, because it's really important in terms of your practice and the ethical guidelines that you're bound by. And our lecturer put to us a scenario to see how we would respond. And the scenario was, you have a client and you finish a session with your client, and the client says, I have no money to get home. I can't pay for a bus. I can't pay for a taxi, and it's raining outside. What do you do? And I was like, I will drive him home. I'll either give him the money, I'll give him the lift, you know. Obviously, that's not the right thing to do. And it was at that moment that I thought, I don't know whether I'm experienced enough or mature enough to be able to detach as I would need to be able to detach in those situations. And so it was a real wake-up call for me. And in actual fact, I ended up taking a year off between that year and the year where I went back to, my 3rd year and my 4th year, and to think a little bit more about that. And it was at that point that I thought maybe I could use what it is I'm passionate about, which is helping people, but not from a clinical perspective. And that's where I started looking into organisational psychology, because you just do really have an opportunity to help people in their work life and to help organisations run really effectively and create an amazing culture without having to worry about dealing with clinical issues. So it was a nice balance. It was a nice balance for me. I still got to do it, but in a way that I didn't feel like I would be putting myself in a situation that I'd struggle to detach from. I think I have often thought about, though, going back, because I do feel like at this point in my career and my life, I have a lot more experience and training that would allow me to do that. But at that time when I was, 21, 22, you know, I just wasn't there.
Yeah. And I think that, you know, that's quite nerve-wracking in itself, right? When you're coming up at such a young age and you get posed such a question, that could be scary. I think.
Yeah.
Okay, and then you start to gain your experience in organisational psych. So what does that encompass essentially?
Yeah, sure. So it's really quite broad. Where I first started in that small consulting company was predominantly psychometric testing. So that's where I learned a lot about what is involved in that, why we do it, how we interpret it, and how we support both candidates and organisations through the process in which they're using those. Then as I moved up to the larger consultancy, which was a national brand, Channel McLeod, which you will probably see on LinkedIn, we did so much more. So that was a lot of what we did for recruitment purposes. It extended then to development purposes. So coaching and leadership coaching and utilising the results from a psychometric assessment to guide and navigate people through their career and personal development. We also did a lot of organisational culture. So we would work with organisations to design the culture that they want and they need, and then also make recommendations on what adjustments do they need to make in their organisation to achieve the culture that they want. We also did team training and development training. So you might have a team, a customer service team, for example, in an organisation, and we would design and develop and implement training for that organisation around building customer service skills. So it was a lot broader with a lot larger organisations. So it was fantastic.
Okay, and so this is where you start to get that real understanding of the psychometric testing and the psychology assessments. For people that may not know what that is, what would you say that is?
Yeah, so psychometric assessment is really two things. So it's your, say, a personality questionnaire, so how people will go about either doing a job or communicating, so really their preferences. And then the second part of psychometric assessment is assessing capability. So that's what we call aptitude testing. So it might be numerical reasoning or verbal reasoning. So it's two very different aspects when they use the term psychometric assessment, but they're often completed together as part of a package depending on the position that somebody's applying for.
And so what does it essentially, what is the breakdown of it, and what is it essentially trying to paint a picture of? What is it trying to tell, I guess, the hiring manager what that is?
Yeah, so in its highest form, I like to think of it as it tells a hiring manager what a person can do, and more importantly, how they will do it. So when we think about the aptitude testing, that's what can this person do? What is their intellectual ability with particular things? So there's a range of different ones. So there's verbal reasoning, which really assesses your ability to read and understand written form. There's numerical reasoning, which, as it suggests, is somebody's ability to work with numerical information and assess the meaning of it and apply it in a particular way. There's abstract reasoning. So if anyone's ever completed one of those weird tests that has pictures and cubes and patterns, and you have to try and work out what is the next, picture in this pattern, that's what we call abstract reasoning. What that essentially assesses is somebody's ability to think critically. So it doesn't rely on numerical or verbal reasoning skills, which are often developed in a person through education. Abstract reasoning is what we say is usually your inherent ability to think critically, which is why it doesn't rely on anything other than random patterns that look very odd. Then there's also things like spatial reasoning. So if anyone's ever done any of those assessments where they have to look at a particular image and work out if this bit moves, what happens to that bit, and you're trying to, go back and forward and assess those things. And then mechanical reasoning, which is again another version of that. So you might have a picture where there's 3 different wheels, and if this one turns that way and then that one turns up, what will happen here? So depending on the role that someone's going for, you wouldn't put anyone through all of those things. It really we would assess the position that somebody's going for, and we would determine which aptitude tests are most aligned to that position. And then you would always do the personality. So you remember that was kind of the second aspect of psychometric assessment. That was always there because that will tell us, this tells us what they can do. And the personality questionnaire tells us how they'll go about applying those skills in the workplace. Okay.
And so with the second one, how, what does that essentially tell the hiring manager? How you're actually going to do the actual job, or how you would actually tackle a task?
Bit of both, yeah. Okay. So if you think about somebody's personality fit, really, so is this person going to fit in with my team on the basis of their natural style? So there's so many different personality questionnaires out there. Essentially what they're all looking to do though is provide the hiring manager or the organisation an understanding of who this person is beneath the surface. We can all kind of put on a particular show in a half an hour interview, but when the going gets tough, what's really under the surface of this person? And it will be things like how they handle high pressure situations, how they go about making decisions and communication, their ability to build relationships, and what does that look like in a workplace setting.
Okay. Now, I was always a sucker. Whenever I did psychometric testing, I would always think that you had to answer it to the way that the organisation or what they were sort of expecting. Is that the right way, or is that the wrong way?
I'm going to say that's the wrong way. I'll tell you why. So I might just quickly go back to, how we talked about the aptitude or the ability-based testing and then the personality testing. With the ability-based testing, there is a right or wrong answer. So you either get this numerical question right or you'll get it wrong. Right. With the personality testing, there is no right or wrong. And so what is also really worthwhile understanding is that personality questionnaires have what we call inbuilt validity scales. So as somebody who's trained to assess in a particular tool, the first thing you always look at is how valid the results are.
Right.
And essentially what that means is that the tests are designed in a way that it can pick up when somebody is trying to present themselves in an overly positive light, in that I have absolutely no flaws and I'm a perfect person.
Right.
No, that's not the case.
Right.
So there was many times, when I was working in consulting, and the first thing I would have to do is look at the results, and then I'd call an individual and say, unfortunately, the results suggest that you've tried to paint yourself in a particularly positive light.
Right.
And because of that, I can't interpret the profile. I don't have confidence in what it's showing me. And so we get them to do it again.
Okay.
Yeah, when you think about you're answering in a way that you want the organisation, or you think the organisation wants you to behave, not only might it impact the validity of the profile, but it doesn't present who you are as a person. And it's really important that people, I think, can sometimes get worried about one question in particular.
Yeah,
and
right.
think, if I answer this, that's not going to look really good, because then they're going to think I'm going to be this really awful person, and they won't want me in the team. It's really important also to understand that not one individual question determines a point on your profile.
Right.
If that makes sense. So right. A number of questions combine together to create a particular scale on your profile. So it's never that individual one.
Okay.
Yeah.
So sorry, keep going.
No, so I was just going to say, so my advice to anyone that's completing a personality, it's really funny, because whenever friends or family or friends of friends know my career history, they'll always say, give us a tip. What should we do? Give us some inside knowledge. And my advice is always the same. It is, do not think twice about the question. Go with your absolute gut instinct, and don't try and think, what will this say about me? Or overanalyze what the question's getting at. Two things will happen. It'll be an incredibly frustrating and long questionnaire to get through. You'll just worry about it in the end. And two, it's unlikely to provide the organisation a true reflection of who you are as a person.
Okay. And because I guess when there's a number of people that sit this test, it will spit out different type of profiles or personalities. At the end stage, once a candidate goes through that, does it create do you fall under a particular bucket per se, and say, this is the type of person you are? Or what are the readings that you would sort of then deliver back and say, okay, this person is maybe a introverted type of individual, and this is how you should then manage this person? Or what are some of the results?
Yeah, so in terms of what it looks like at the end and whether we can put people in a bucket, so to speak, there's two types of personality questionnaires. There's something that we call a type inventory and a trait inventory. Right. So a type-based inventory or assessment or questionnaire is what does exactly what you said. It puts you in a bit of a bucket, so to speak. So if anybody's done anything like the MBTI or the DISC, what that will do is give you a particular category that you fit into. They're great for team development. I find they're really good, because when you give the results at such a high level, in terms of you sit in this bucket and you sit in that bucket, and if you've scored the same as them, you all go and stand next to each other. It's a really, really high level, nice way of saying, that's why you're like that, because you communicate like what this bucket says. I communicate. So from a team perspective, love that.
Okay.
Whenever we're looking at recruitment or individual development, I always prefer a trait-based assessment, because it gives you much more information. So if I was to put somebody on a trait-based assessment and get their profile printed out, no two profiles will ever be exactly the same. Okay. Because there's so many different scales and so many different ways in which you can respond, that no one's exactly the same. So it makes no it's no surprise then that no two personality traits, when you're doing that type of assessment, are the same. And that's why I love those ones in particular, because it hits the marks with specific individuals. Right.
Okay. And then I guess once that hiring manager gets that result, will that sway their decision in any way, or is it just them knowing, okay, this person will behave like this, and this is how I should then deal with this individual?
So it really depends on at what point you're taking the psychometric assessment. So what people may find is if you've applied for a bulk recruitment intake, for example, so I know a lot of the emergency services do a bulk different screening assessments until you appointed to a role. If it's at an early stage, it is a way of determining who makes it to the next stage, particularly aptitude assessment.
Okay.
So, for example, I used to do a bit of work with the CFA. And as part of that, we would do a big intake every year. And one of the very first screening post the physical screening was the aptitude screening. So they would do numerical reasoning, verbal reasoning, abstract and mechanical reasoning, and they had a particular cutoff. And that's purely because of the amount of people who apply. So at that point, what a manager gets is an indication of who can move up to the next round, and then they continue on with the other assessments involved in the recruitment process. That's not as common in terms of what I've done. I often worked with organisations and hiring managers towards the end of the application process. So normally this was taken, my recommendation is to always take it prior to the last interview when you're down to a couple of candidates. The outcome of a psychometric assessment should never be the deciding factor. It is a piece of the puzzle that gives managers and organisations a scientific aspect to assessing a candidate's capability and organisational fit, because we've still got things like their resume, their cover letter, their interview. If they do, a group-based assessment as part of, sometimes you sit around a table and there's a scenario to complete as a group. That might be an element of the candidate assessment process. Reference checks. So it's another piece of the puzzle. Generally, what I would do with my clients is once they would have, say, their top 2 or top 3, we would sit down and look at all of the results. What we call an assessment battery, which is the type of tests that need to be completed, as I said earlier, were designed based on the role. So, for example, if it was a CFO position, you would assume correctly that the numerical reasoning component is particularly important. So what we would do is we'd put them through all of that, and we'd get around the table and look at, say, the top 3 candidates. And obviously we'd look at the numerical reasoning and be like, great, as hoped, they're all above average in terms of their numerical reasoning. We'd then look at their verbal and their abstract reasoning. I actually really love the abstract reasoning, and the reason for that is it also assesses somebody's inherent ability to learn. So if we have somebody who's quite early in their career and their numerical reasoning or their verbal reasoning might be average or just below average, but their abstract reasoning is at the higher end, the way I'm interpreting that for my clients is I would say, yes, right now, this individual's verbal and numerical reasoning might not be as strong as some of your other candidates, but their ability to learn is a lot stronger. So if you invest in that person, they will get there eventually. So that's why I love that one so much, particularly when I'm giving feedback to candidates and sometimes they haven't done so well. I really like to invest time in explaining that to them. So it's, number one, not so disheartening, but it helps kind of put them on a particular pathway if that's something that they did want to improve in.
Okay. And you've also touched on verbal reasoning. What are the main things that you can particularly expect from that type of test? And where do you sometimes see candidates go wrong in that angle?
So an example of some of the things you will see is it might say something like, I'm going to try and think of something now. Cat is to tree as fish is to, and then there's a blank and there's a whole heap of different, and you're thinking, I don't know. And so what that is about is your ability to reason with the words to say, right, well, what's the connection between the cat and the tree? And therefore, how do I apply a similar connection to a fish? And it might say shoe, or it might say chips, or it might say water. And then you start, does that make sense?
Yeah, right. Okay. Okay.
And so does that.
And that's just for them to see, to understand like for like words or something like that?
Yeah. And then there's also other ones where it will be a big paragraph or a couple of paragraphs. You have to read that and then answer questions about your understanding of the words that you've just read, or the story, or the report that you're reading. So what that tells us is somebody's ability to communicate. So what does that look like? How articulate? What's their vocabulary like? What's their ability to analyze written documentation or reports, or generate reports in terms of the scale of their language skills? That's what that's essentially telling.
Now, I know that there's been times where I've been doing the test as well, and then I sometimes see the timer and it's ticking down, and I'm like, oh, I think I should just click whatever answer just to get through it. Is that the right way?
I guess it really depends on the aptitude test that you're taking, and that's why it's really important that at the start you read all of the instructions, because sometimes the answer will be yes, and then sometimes the answer will be no. So for example, there was times where I knew the particular assessment that I was providing somebody will be calculated on the basis of all questions available. And so my advice to them would always be, do not leave any of them unfinished, because say there's 30 questions, you're 20 questions through and the time's about to run out. Just go through and put anything for the last 10, because you never know, you might get another 2 right, and that will boost your percentage overall. There will be others though where it is based on how many you got correct through the assessment rather than finishing it. And what I mean by that is, when we were interpreting particular results, let's say I went on and I did a numerical reasoning assessment. There were 30 questions. I only got through 20. Whilst that will impact the overall result, so that might then equate to, say, what we call, say, average. Right. What I would be, the level of interpretation I would have been able to give a client was, yes, Jade's response was in the average range. However, when we look at her accuracy, it was 100%. So while she only got through 20 of the 30, she got all of them right. So it adds a layer of interpretation and story that we can provide the business about the type of aptitude you have in that space. But that's why I always recommend make sure you read all of the instructions from start to finish before you go in. Certainly, I mean, if you're down to the last 10 seconds and you've only got 2 questions left, absolutely have a guess, because 2 questions is not going to have such a significant impact on your overall rating, be it above average, below average, and you might get the last 2 right. So okay. I would always recommend for that case, just have a guess for the last couple.
Okay, and so say, for example, in some of the tests where you are able to click an answer, and it won't affect. So you're saying, so say, for example, the person that did 20 out of 30, they would be judged on that 20 out of 30. But if, for example, there were 10 questions left and you just wanted to answer them, that could be still beneficial for you?
Yeah, I think so. It really depends. From my perspective, it depends what the instructions say. And from a psychologist perspective, when I'm reading it, it's the level of data I have access to. Right. So if all it's going to give me is a percentile ranking, and I guess that's something I haven't necessarily explained, have I, which is the way the results are presented is in the form of a percentile. And what that means is it's not based on percentage of accuracy. It's based on where your score forms in a particular cohort. So, for example, you might have a verbal reasoning assessment, let's say, and the cohort or the comparator group will be the normal, everyday, what they call general population. Right. Or you might be doing a verbal reasoning assessment against a management population. And what that means is the percentile scores will be different. So let's say if I'm compared to a general population group, which is an everyday person, right, and I'm at the 50th percentile, what that means is the score that I got, be it 20 out of 30, for example, was within the average range. It means that I was halfway between what the general population scored. If my percentile was, let's say, at the 60th percentile, which might be considered above average, it means the amount that I got right, be it the 20 out of 30, was better than 60% of the general population. However, there was 40% of the population, the general population, that scored higher. So they might have got, anywhere between 21 and 30 correct. Right. So that is what you need to keep in mind when you're thinking about the ranking you're going to get. It's based on the percentile as opposed to your percentage.
Right. Yes. Okay.
Yeah. And that's where, there will be times where I was working with a client and let's say somebody's abstract reasoning score was was at the 55th percentile against a management population group. And that's considered average. And they'll say, oh, that's not, I expected it to be higher. I would point out to them, you've got to realize that the norm group that this person is being compared to is at a management level. You're not talking about the everyday person. So if you've got somebody who is in the average range, that means they're like most people in a management position. That actually brings a stronger element to the result as opposed to being in the average range of the general population, because at a manager level, you're already comparing yourself to a completely different cohort of people.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So that's when you hear the term percentile, that's what it's referring to. It's not percentage of accuracy.
Lastly, would there be any final advice that you would give to candidates that have an upcoming test?
So I always just suggest that people put themselves in an environment that is quiet.
Yeah.
Try and do it at a time when you were feeling at your best. And I know we're all struggling in the current environment for sure. And there is always things going on in our life. But, if you feel like you've got 10 minutes and then you've got to rush to work, you'll quickly get them. That's not the best time. Find a time that, you are a bit more settled. You're not rushed. It's quiet. With the numerical reasoning assessments, there will be the opportunity to use calculators with some of the tests. So read the instructions really well before. The last thing you want to do is assume that I'll to use a calculator and actually work. Make sure you're very prepared like that. With regard to the personality questionnaire, as I said, so they're never timed. There's never a right or a wrong. And so just go through it without thinking too much. Don't overanalyze the questions. Just go with your first natural response and move through them that way.
Yeah, right. Okay, very good. And now I know that we are going to do a part 2 to all this. I know that Jade has got a lot of information that she can share with everyone. But I'm going to wrap it up and say, Jade, what has been your best career advice to date? I know I've put you on the spot, so it might be...
Look, I think something, and it probably is the same advice a lot of people give, it's find something that you love to do, or find something where you feel like you're making a difference in a way. And I know when I'm doing something that I'm meant to be doing, when time flies by without me realizing. So there will be tasks where I get into something, and before I know it, I look up and an hour has passed, and that's when I know I'm doing something that I'm supposed to be doing and that I am naturally drawn to. But in saying that, I also think try everything, because you don't know what you don't know. And I might actually throw a bit of a spanner in the works here.
Yeah,
something
please.
That's not on my LinkedIn profile.
Yeah.
I did have a little weird moment in my career. I actually joined Victoria Police for a very short period of time.
Right.
Yeah. So I would just say try anything. And in actual fact, that whilst that avenue or that career path wasn't for me, and I realized that very quickly, it changed the way I applied myself in my career since, and gave me so much more confidence to do what I do. It really changed my outlook. So I recommend trying everything. If you can work with somebody who can give you a little bit of insight. Sometimes when you say find something you love, people are, I don't know.
Yeah, so true.
If you can work with somebody to find what some of your natural preferences are, because sometimes they're hidden pretty deep and we're exposed to so much these days, and you think, that looks really cool on Instagram, I'm going to do that. Or, you see something on reality TV and you think, wow, I want to be a YouTuber. Maybe you do. But, I do a lot of work with people, even within the Northern Health, for example, and externally, where we work through, well, what are some of your natural preferences? We get them to do a psychometric assessment. It's not necessarily for recruitment, but it's for self-development. And we get them to say, well, your personality profile suggests that you're somebody who's really outgoing and you're really quite social. What's your current work environment like? And then I find out they're sitting in a dark cupboard,
yes,
away at something. Very extreme example, but you know what I mean. And we say, well, maybe that's why you're not really enjoying things at the moment. What other options are available? And that's how I've tried to lead my career, I think, is find things that I think I will enjoy, give it a go. If yes, great, continue. If not, okay, well, what did I learn from that? And then how can I move on and apply it in a different way?
Yeah, very good. Very good. And now if people wanted to connect with you or even just ask you questions, or if they sort of needed help, are you happy for them to reach out to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The benefits of social media, click on my LinkedIn profile, and I'd love to chat further with anyone.
Yeah, 100%. I'll pop your details in the description so people can get and reach out to you.
Great. Thank you.
No, thank you. We'll do it again, hopefully in a new setting once lockdown's all done and dusted. We'll hopefully get that podcast studio going, and we'll do round 2.
Love to. Thank you so much. It's been great.
No, thank you. All right.